On a cold, clear spring morning in the year 1870, a gold prospector named Frank Lemon was riding his horse along the muddy banks of the North Saskatchewan River. This is a massive, winding river that cuts through the wild, rugged terrain of Alberta and Saskatchewan in Canada. Frank was at the very back of a long line of about a dozen men, and all of these men had been hired for a very specific and highly lucrative job. They were employed by a very wealthy, ambitious, and demanding investor named Lafayette French. Lafayette French had a lot of money, but he wanted to get even richer, and he knew that the Canadian wilderness was hiding untold fortunes. So he had commissioned this group of tough, experienced, and hardened outdoorsmen to venture deep into the unexplored, dangerous Canadian wilderness to look for viable gold mines. The deal they had signed was very simple. If these men could find a viable gold mine, Lafayette French would use his immense financial resources to bankroll a massive, full-scale mining operation. He would pull out all the gold he could, and the men who had actually discovered the mine would get a massive, legally binding cut of the profits. This cut would make them incredibly wealthy for the rest of their lives. When Frank had first signed up for this gig, he thought it was the absolute opportunity of a lifetime. He was so excited about the potential wealth that he had even convinced his absolute best friend in the world to join the expedition. His friend went by the nickname Blackjack. Frank and Blackjack had been through everything together, from hard winters to failed business ventures, and Frank could not imagine embarking on such a huge, life-changing adventure without him. But now, after weeks of riding through the dense, dark woods, dealing with freezing rain, and sleeping on the cold, hard ground, the excitement had completely worn off. They had searched river after river, valley after valley, and they had found absolutely nothing. Frank was exhausted, his body was incredibly sore, and all he really wanted to do at this point was pack up his gear and go home. And so, as the line of men continued their slow, quiet ride along the riverbank, Frank completely zoned out. He was just sitting in his leather saddle, letting his horse guide itself, while he stared off into the thick, dark forest that lined the river. He was just looking at the endless trees, feeling totally defeated and miserable. But then, as he was scanning the woods to his right, something strange caught his eye. Deep among the thick, tangled trees, there was a tiny, narrow dirt path. It looked like a little trail that wound its way off into the deep forest, disappearing into the dark shadows. For some strange reason, the moment Frank saw this trail, he felt this incredibly powerful, almost magnetic urge to follow it. It was like a physical pull. He pulled hard on his horse's reins, bringing the animal to a complete stop, and he just sat there staring at this little dirt path. Frank started thinking about their trip so far. For weeks, they had done nothing but search the North Saskatchewan River and its main tributaries, and they had found absolutely nothing. So, Frank thought to himself, what if they were looking in the wrong place? What if the gold was not in the main river at all? What if it was hidden deep inside the woods? And what if this strange little trail led right to it? Frank turned around to tell the rest of the group about his idea. He wanted to see if they would be willing to check out this trail. But when he looked back down the riverbank, he saw that the rest of the men had already ridden far ahead. They were focused on the river and had not even noticed that Frank had stopped. The only person who had stayed behind was his best friend Blackjack. Blackjack had stopped his horse just a few yards away, and he was just looking at Frank with a tired, questioning expression. Now, Frank did not care at all that the rest of the group had left them behind. He was completely over the expedition anyway, and frankly, he did not particularly like the other men in the group. They were rough, impatient, and hard to get along with. So Frank looked over at Blackjack, pointed toward the dark trail in the woods, and gestured as if to ask if he wanted to go this way instead. Blackjack, who was just as sick of the fruitless search and the rest of the group as Frank was, smiled and gave a quick nod of his head. He was basically saying, yeah, let's do it, let's get out of here. And so, the two best friends turned their horses away from the river, away from their group, and began heading down this thin, winding dirt trail deeper and deeper into the dark forest. For several hours, Frank and Blackjack rode in silence. The trees around them grew thicker and taller, blocking out most of the sunlight, so it felt like they were riding through a perpetual twilight. The trail was narrow, and they had absolutely no idea where it was leading them, but that strange, powerful feeling of being drawn forward only grew stronger. However, as they rode deeper into the woods, Frank started to get a really bad feeling. He kept hearing these strange, quiet noises coming from the woods around them. It sounded like faint, whispered voices and heavy, rustling footsteps right behind them on the trail. But every single time Frank stopped his horse and spun around to look, there was nobody there. The only person behind him was Blackjack, who was just riding along. Eventually, the feeling got so intense and so unsettling that Frank decided to speak up. He stopped his horse, looked back at Blackjack, and asked him if he was hearing anything strange out here. To Frank's surprise, Blackjack nodded and said that yes, he had been hearing the exact same things. He had heard the whispers and the footsteps too. But every time Blackjack had turned around, he had seen absolutely nothing. They were completely alone in the middle of a massive, silent forest. Now, the two men did not want to panic, so they did what people often do in scary situations. They came up with a logical explanation. They convinced themselves that the noises they were hearing must be the sounds of the rest of their mining party. They figured that the group had eventually realized Frank and Blackjack were missing, and now they were out in the woods searching for them. But Frank and Blackjack had absolutely no intention of rejoining the group. They liked the idea of being on their own, and so they decided to just ignore the strange noises and keep moving forward. After another hour of riding, the narrow dirt path finally led them out of the thick trees and brought them to the edge of a beautiful, crystal-clear stream. The water was bubbling over the rocks, and it looked incredibly inviting. Both men were exhausted and thirsty, so they got off their horses, tied them to some nearby branches, and walked down to the water's edge. They knelt down on the gravelly shore, took out their metal canteens, and scooped them into the cool water to get a drink. But as Frank dipped his canteen into the stream, he suddenly froze. He stared down into the water, his eyes wide with shock. Sitting right there on the shallow, rocky bottom of the stream, completely undisturbed, were several massive, shiny nuggets of pure gold. Frank literally could not believe his eyes. He had been searching for weeks, finding absolutely nothing, and now, here in the middle of nowhere, there was gold just sitting in the open. Frank reached out, grabbed Blackjack by the shoulder, and pulled him over to look. When Blackjack saw the gold, his jaw dropped. The two men looked at each other, their faces filled with pure excitement, and they realized they had actually done it. They had found gold. But Frank, trying to keep his composure, looked at Blackjack and said that before they started celebrating, they needed to see exactly what they were dealing with here. He suggested they walk upstream to find the source of the gold nuggets. So, the two men stood up, their hearts pounding with excitement, and began walking along the edge of the water. As they moved further upstream, they noticed that the gold in the water was not thinning out. In fact, there was more and more of it. The deeper they went, the larger the nuggets became, until eventually they reached a high rock ledge where a small waterfall was pouring down into the stream. When they looked at the rock face of the ledge, they both gasped. Running directly through the solid stone were massive, thick veins of pure gold. They had not just found a few loose nuggets, they had stumbled upon a gargantuan, completely untouched gold mine. This mine was so massive that it was clearly worth a fortune. It could easily be worth millions, maybe even billions of dollars in today's money. At this point, Frank and Blackjack could not contain themselves. They began jumping up and down, hugging each other, and laughing in sheer disbelief. They were going to be incredibly rich. But then, as the initial rush of excitement began to fade, the two friends suddenly fell silent. They sat down on the rocks, and a heavy, tense atmosphere settled over them as they realized they now faced a massive dilemma. You see, the entire reason Frank and Blackjack were out here in the Canadian wilderness was because they had been hired by Lafayette French. Under the terms of their contract, they were legally and morally obligated to report any gold they found directly to him. If they did that, Lafayette French would take over the mine, get unimaginably wealthy, and he would write Frank and Blackjack a check for their troubles. But while that check would be a lot of money to a normal person, it would be a tiny fraction of what the mine was actually worth, or they had another option. They could choose to keep this discovery a complete secret. They could lie to Lafayette French, tell him they found nothing, and then the two of them could return to this spot by themselves whenever they wanted. They could slowly mine the gold on their own, sneak it out of the woods, and keep all of the immense wealth for themselves. Of course, this second option was highly illegal and extremely risky. If Lafayette French ever found out that they had stolen a massive gold mine right out from under him, they would go to prison for a very long time, or worse. So, Frank and Blackjack talked it over, and they decided that this decision was simply too massive to make on the fly. They agreed that they would camp out right here by the stream for the night, sleep on it, and make their final decision in the morning. So the two men walked over to a small, flat clearing nearby to pitch their camp. Blackjack went off into the woods to gather some dry firewood, while Frank stayed behind to set up their canvas tent. But as Frank was working on the tent, hammering the stakes into the ground, he suddenly heard those strange whispered voices again. It sounded like people whispering just beyond the tree line, right at the edge of the clearing. Frank stopped what he was doing and spun around, scanning the trees, but he saw absolutely nothing. He figured that maybe Blackjack was playing a trick on him, or maybe Blackjack was just talking to himself as he gathered wood. But then, Frank heard the whispers coming from his right, and when he looked to his left, he saw Blackjack standing on the completely opposite side of the clearing, carrying an armful of wood. It could not have been him. Frank felt a cold shiver run down his spine. It truly felt like there was something invisible in these woods, watching them, listening to their conversation. But Frank shook it off, telling himself he was just tired and let his imagination get the better of him. A few hours later, the two men were sitting on a log in front of a crackling campfire, eating their rations and talking about the gold. Frank, who had been thinking about the money all evening, finally decided to speak his mind. He looked at Blackjack and said that they would be absolutely foolish to tell Lafayette French about the mine. He argued that it made no sense to take a one-time payday from a wealthy man when they could have an endless supply of wealth for the rest of their lives. But when Frank looked at Blackjack expecting his friend to agree, he saw that Blackjack was looking down at the ground, shaking his head. Blackjack looked up and told Frank that he could not do it. He said that lying and stealing the gold was morally wrong, and that he would rather be poor and honest than rich and morally bankrupt. Hearing this, Frank got incredibly frustrated. He tried to argue, but Blackjack refused to budge. What started as a quiet civil discussion quickly escalated into a full-blown screaming argument. Both men stood up, shouting at each other in the firelight, completely unwilling to compromise. Finally, Blackjack threw his hands up in the air, shouted that he was done talking about it, turned around, and stormed into the tent, zipping it shut behind him. Frank stood by the fire, breathing heavily, absolutely furious. He could not understand why his best friend was being so stubborn. Eventually, Frank realized he needed to calm down. He decided to go to bed, figuring they could try to talk about it again in the morning when they were both level-headed. So, he walked over to the tent, crawled inside, and got into his sleeping bag without saying a word to Blackjack, but Frank could not sleep. He lay there in the dark, listening to the loud, steady sound of Blackjack snoring right next to him. And the longer Frank lay there, the angrier he got. He kept thinking about how Blackjack was going to ruin everything. If Blackjack insisted on being honest, he would tell Lafayette French, and Frank's dream of endless wealth would be shattered. Frank's thoughts grew darker and darker. He realized that Blackjack was no longer just his friend. He was an obstacle. He was a problem that needed to be solved. In a state of pure, uncontrolled rage, Frank got out of his sleeping bag, walked out of the tent, and grabbed their camp axe. He walked back into the dark tent, raised the heavy axe high above his head, and drove it directly into Blackjack's skull, killing his best friend instantly. A few minutes later, Frank was outside sitting by the dying campfire, staring blankly at his blood-soaked hands. He was in complete shock, unable to comprehend how he had just murdered his best friend. But as he sat there, a loud twig snapped near the tent. Frank jumped up, terrified, looking toward the dark structure. Suddenly, a low, guttural moaning sound began to echo from inside the tent. It sounded like a dying animal, but Frank knew Blackjack was dead. His head had been split in half. There was no way he was making that sound. But the moaning only got louder and closer, moving toward Frank. And then, the whispered voices returned, swirling all around him in the dark. This time, they were crystal clear, and they said, "You are going to be tortured for what you did to Blackjack." Then, just as suddenly as they started, the voices and the moaning stopped. The entire forest went dead silent, and then a blood-curdling, high-pitched human scream ripped through the silence from inside the tent. Frank did not wait another second. He sprinted to his horse, jumped into the saddle, and rode away as fast as he could, leaving the gold, his friend's body, and everything else behind. He could hear the whispers and heavy footsteps chasing him through the dark woods, but he never looked back. Hours later, Frank emerged from the tree line and arrived in a small village they had passed through earlier. The whispering and footsteps finally stopped. Frank, convinced he was being haunted by Blackjack's vengeful ghost, ran into the local church and waited for the priest. When the priest arrived at dawn, Frank confessed to the murder and begged for help. But as the priest listened, he did not care about Frank's soul. All the priest could think about was the massive gold mine Frank had described. A wave of intense greed washed over the priest. He told Frank to leave town and never return, promising that he would go bury Blackjack to appease the ghost. Once Frank was gone, the priest sent his friend, an experienced outdoorsman named John McDougal, to find the campsite, bury the body, and claim the gold. John found the camp and the body, but as he began to dig a grave, he too heard the terrifying whispered voices in the trees. Despite his fear, John buried Blackjack, placed heavy stones on the grave, and went to look for the gold. But the voices and a terrifying, high-pitched laughter in the woods scared him so badly that he fled. A few days later, John and the priest convinced themselves it was just their imagination, so John returned with a group of men. But when they arrived, John froze. The heavy stones he had placed on the grave were completely gone, and the blood-soaked tent had vanished without a trace. It was like the campsite had never existed. Spooked beyond belief, John and the men fled. John went straight to a local bar, started drinking heavily, and died of alcohol poisoning just a few days later. After John's death, the priest attempted to find the gold, but a massive forest fire broke out, completely destroying the trail and the surrounding forest. Years later, Lafayette French heard about the mine and spent 30 years searching for it. He finally wrote a letter saying he had found it, but that very same night, his cabin burned to the ground with him inside, destroying the secret forever. To this day, the location of the Lost Lemon Mine remains a mystery, and many believe it is protected by a deadly curse. Now, our next story takes us to the spring of 1990, to a small, quiet community in southern China called Pingyang Township. This is a very beautiful rural area made up of several small, tight-knit villages where everyone knows everyone else's business. On a warm afternoon, a young mother was busy cleaning up her family's living room, sweeping the floor, and putting away toys. She was almost finished with her chores when she suddenly heard the sound of her 3-year-old twin daughters crying from their nursery down the hall. This immediately stopped her in her tracks because, while 3-year-olds cry all the time, her daughters almost never did. The girls' names were Sai and Shi Hung Woo. From the day they were born, they had been incredibly unusual babies. They were almost entirely silent, never crying, never babbling, and they spent the vast majority of their time just laying in their cribs, sleeping. Even now, at 3 years old, they had not yet spoken their very first words. So, hearing them cry like this was highly unusual. The mother rushed down the hallway, pushed open the nursery door, and saw her twin girls sitting in their crib, sobbing hysterically. They looked completely terrified. The mother ran over, scooped them up in her arms, and tried to comfort them, asking what was wrong. But the girls could not answer. They just clung to her, crying. The mother checked them over for any physical injuries or signs of illness, but they seemed completely healthy. Eventually, the girls calmed down, and their mother placed them back in their crib, where they quickly fell back asleep. A few days later, the twins were back to their normal, silent routine, sleeping for most of the day. As they slept, their mother was walking down the hallway past their bedroom. The door was shut, and the house was completely quiet, but as she passed the door, she suddenly stopped. She could hear noises coming from inside the nursery. But it was not the sound of crying or fussing. It was the sound of speaking. The mother wanted to run in, but she was afraid she would startle them and they would stop. So, she quietly leaned her head against the wooden door and listened. To her absolute astonishment, her 3-year-old daughters, who had never spoken a word in their lives, were having a fluent, adult-level conversation with each other. They were speaking in complete, complex sentences, back and forth, like two old friends. But as the mother listened closely to what they were saying, a cold feeling of dread began to creep over her. The twins were talking in vivid detail about people, places, and events in a completely different village. It was a village that was miles away, a place where these little girls had never been, and people they had never met. They were discussing specific names, past events, and secrets that no 3-year-old could possibly know. Now, in most parts of the world, a mother hearing this would immediately call a doctor or a psychologist. But this mother lived in Pingyang Township, and that meant she understood exactly what was happening. You see, Pingyang Township has a very strange and famous secret. Out of the roughly 7,000 people who live in this small township, more than 100 of them claim to be the reincarnated spirits of people who died traumatic deaths. And this is not just a claim that people laugh off. The entire community, all 7,000 residents, fully believe that these people are indeed reincarnated. This belief is so deeply integrated into their daily lives that it affects how people interact and even how they conduct business. For instance, it is completely normal for a reincarnated person to walk up to a neighbor and demand that they pay back a debt that was owed to them in a previous life, and the neighbor will actually pay it. There have even been physical fights in the middle of the street because a reincarnated person claimed that a neighbor's family member had insulted them decades ago in a past life. The townspeople even make major life decisions based on these claims. There was a young boy in the township who claimed that in his past life he was a pig that had been slaughtered by the local butcher. When the butcher heard about this, he was so filled with guilt and fear of offending the boy's spirit that he actually shut down his entire business and found a completely different line of work. So, when this mother heard her little girls speaking fluently about a distant village, she did not call a doctor. Instead, she realized that her daughters were reincarnated spirits. She decided that the right thing to do was to get the word out to the neighboring villages, hoping that the families of whoever her daughters used to be would hear about it and come forward. Sure enough, less than a week later, a man and a woman from the distant village arrived at the mother's house. When she let them inside, the twin girls immediately ran to them. One of the twins looked up at the woman and called her mother, while the other twin called the man father. The 3-year-old girls then proceeded to sit down and tell this couple an incredibly detailed, tragic story. They explained that in their past lives, they were not sisters at all. Instead, they were 2 teenage girls who were best friends living in that distant village. The twins explained that about a month before they were reborn as twins, they had made a tragic pact and had taken their own lives together. They described the exact location where they had done it, what they were wearing, and even how their bodies had been discovered by the search parties. The man and the woman sat there, tears streaming down their faces, and they looked at the twins' biological mother and confirmed that every single detail the little girls had just shared was 100% true. The twins then turned to their biological mother and explained that the reason they had been so silent for the first 3 years of their lives was because they were trying to keep their past lives a secret, fearing that people would think they were monsters. They also explained that they slept so much because when they closed their eyes, they could dream of their old home, which they missed terribly. To this day, no scientist or researcher has ever been able to find a logical explanation for how these 2 toddler girls possessed such intimate, accurate knowledge of a tragic event and a family they had never encountered. In Pingyang Township, the twins are widely accepted as living proof of life after death. For our third story, we are going to head back in time to the spring of 1883, to the dusty and dangerous Arizona frontier. In a tiny, isolated settlement called Eagle Creek, A young woman named Sarah was busy tidying up her small wooden farmhouse. As Sarah swept the floors, her sister Elizabeth grabbed a heavy wooden bucket and walked outside to fetch water from the natural spring located a short distance from the house. Sarah and Elizabeth lived together in this farmhouse along with their husbands and their collective 4 young children. In the late 19th century, the American West was an incredibly wild and lawless place, so families often lived together in group homes for safety. The women's husbands spent most of their days out in the rugged hills herding sheep, while Sarah and Elizabeth stayed behind to run the household and watch over the children. On this particular afternoon, while Elizabeth was outside, the family's guard dogs, who were chained up in the front yard, suddenly began barking in an incredibly wild, aggressive manner. This immediately caught Sarah's attention because these dogs were highly trained and usually very quiet. They only barked like this if something dangerous was approaching. Sarah told the 4 children to stay put inside the house, and she stepped out onto the front porch to see what had upset the animals. She stood on the porch and scanned the dry, rocky landscape. To her left and right, there was nothing but barren dirt and low scrub brush. But directly in front of the house, there was a large, steep sandy hill that blocked their view of the trail leading into the valley. The dogs were all straining against their chains, baring their teeth, and staring directly at the top of this hill. At first, Sarah did not see anything, and she wondered if the dogs were just barking at a coyote or a snake. But then, a massive creature slowly rose over the crest of the hill and began descending directly toward the farmhouse. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, and she froze in absolute terror. The creature was enormous, standing much taller than any horse. It had 4 long, spindly legs, a coat of dark red fur, and a bizarre, twisted hump on its back, but what footage Sarah even more was what was sitting on the back of this beast. Clinging to the creature's back was a figure that looked like a man, but it was far from human. The figure's face was pale, sunken, and completely devoid of eyes, leaving dark, empty sockets staring forward. Its lips were pulled back into a massive, horrific, toothy grin that stretched from ear to ear. Sarah was a deeply religious woman, and as she watched this red monster and its terrifying rider charge down the hill, she became convinced that she was looking at the devil himself. She believed the end of the world had come and that this demonic entity was coming to slaughter her family. Instinctively, Sarah bolted back inside the house, slammed the heavy wooden door, and shoved their massive kitchen table against it to barricade it shut. She then gathered the 4 terrified children, huddled with them in the corner of the kitchen, and began praying loudly to God to protect them. But as she was praying, a horrific, blood-curdling scream echoed from the direction of the water spring outside. It was a high-pitched, agonizing scream, and Sarah immediately recognized the voice. It was her sister, Elizabeth. Sarah wanted to run out and help her sister, but she was completely paralyzed by fear, and she knew she could not leave the children unprotected inside the house. So she stayed in the corner, clutching the children, and continued to pray while the terrible silence settled over the property once again. Several hours passed, and Sarah remained trapped inside her barricaded home. Elizabeth had not returned, and there was no sound from outside. Finally, just as the sun was beginning to set, Sarah heard the heavy sound of footsteps walking onto the wooden porch. She held her breath as the doorknob began to turn, rattling loudly against the heavy barricade. Sarah and the children began to scream, believing the devil had come to break the door down. But then, a voice called out from the other side of the door. It was the voice of Sarah's husband, accompanied by Elizabeth's husband. They had just returned from the fields and were confused as to why the door was barricaded. Sobbing hysterically, Sarah pushed the table away, opened the door, and threw herself into her husband's arms. She told him everything, explaining that the devil on a red beast had come over the hill and that she had heard Elizabeth scream from the spring. Terrified for Elizabeth's safety, the 2 men grabbed their rifles and lanterns and ran down the dark path toward the spring. When they arrived, they found a horrifying scene. Elizabeth was lying face down in the dirt next to her spilled water bucket surrounded by a pool of blood. She was dead. The ground all around her body was completely torn up, covered in massive, deep hoofprints. Elizabeth's husband collapsed in grief, while Sarah's husband rode into the nearest town to fetch the local coroner. When the coroner arrived and examined the body, he concluded that Elizabeth had been trampled to death. However, when he looked at the massive hoofprints in the dirt, he was completely baffled. He noted that the prints were far too large and the wrong shape to belong to a horse or an ox. Because he could not identify the animal, the coroner officially listed Elizabeth's cause of death as unknown. But the story of the devil on the red beast quickly spread throughout the Arizona territory. Before long, everyone was talking about the legendary red ghost. Over the next few years, sightings of this creature became incredibly common. Campers claimed the red ghost would charge through their camps in the dead of night, trampling their tents. One cowboy even claimed he managed to throw a lasso around the creature's neck, but the beast was so incredibly strong that it dragged him through the brush until he was forced to cut the rope. For nearly 10 years, the red ghost terrorized the people of Arizona. Then, one morning, a farmer living in eastern Arizona looked out his kitchen window and saw a massive red-furred, humped animal standing in his turnip patch. The farmer, who had heard the terrifying stories of the red ghost, grabbed his rifle, aimed out the window, and fired a single shot. The giant creature collapsed to the ground, dead. The farmer cautiously walked out to the turnip patch to inspect the legendary beast. When he got close, he realized that the legend of the red ghost was actually a tragic mix-up of two very real things. The creature itself was a camel. In the mid-1800s, the United States military had launched an experimental program called the Camel Corps, importing camels from the Mediterranean to haul supplies across the desert Southwest. Several of these camels had escaped into the wild, and this red camel was one of them. But what about the terrifying, grinning devil on its back? When the farmer looked closely at the camel's saddle, he gasped. Strapped tightly to the saddle with thick leather straps was a heavily decomposed human skeleton. It turned out that years earlier, a man had been riding this camel and had likely died while strapped to the saddle to prevent him from falling off. As the camel roamed the desert for a decade, the man's body rotted away, leaving an eyeless, grinning skull and skeleton bouncing on its back. This horrific sight is what had terrified Sarah and created the legend of the Red Ghost. Today, the legend of the Red Ghost is still remembered in Arizona history, a bizarre reminder of the wild and unpredictable frontier. Our fourth story takes us to northwestern Germany on a hot summer afternoon in July of 2016. A 23-year-old college student named Felix was standing in the break room of an industrial manufacturing company where he was working a summer job. Felix was studying hard to become a mechanical engineer, and during his university breaks, he worked at this factory as a machine mechanic to help pay for his tuition. Because he was just a college kid, he was by far the youngest employee at the company, which often made him feel like an outsider. Most of his coworkers were middle-aged men who had been working at the factory for decades, and they rarely paid any attention to him. On this day, Felix poured some cereal into a bowl, grabbed his carton of lactose-free milk from the communal fridge, and sat down at a table where two older coworkers, Otto and Klaus, were already eating. Both men were in their 50s. Klaus was known around the factory as a quiet, bizarre loner who almost never spoke to anyone, while Otto was generally friendly but looked incredibly tired on this day. Felix tried to break the awkward silence by asking how their day was going. Klaus just stared at him, shrugged, and went back to eating his sandwich without saying a word. Otto, however, sighed and told Felix that he was having a terrible day. He explained that his head was throbbing, his stomach was cramping, and he felt completely exhausted. Felix offered his sympathy, and the three men went back to eating in silence. After finishing his cereal, Felix cleaned his bowl and walked back out to the factory floor to resume his shift. But he had only been working for a few minutes when he was hit by a sudden, agonizing stomach cramp that made him double over in pain. Felix was lactose intolerant, so he was used to occasional stomach aches if he accidentally consumed dairy. But this pain was much more intense than anything he had felt before. He wondered if he had accidentally grabbed someone else's regular milk from the fridge instead of his own lactose-free carton. He ran back into the break room and opened the fridge to check. But there was only one carton of milk in the fridge, and it was his. There was no way he had consumed dairy. Within minutes, Felix became so violently nauseous that he knew he could not finish his shift. He told his supervisor he was sick, drove home, and spent the next hour vomiting. While he felt a bit better after throwing up as he stood at the bathroom sink to wash his face, he noticed a strange, tingling sensation in the tips of his fingers. He flexed his hands, trying to get the blood flowing, but the numbness only spread. Felix called his mother, who advised him to rest and see a doctor if it did not improve. 2 weeks later, Felix was still incredibly sick. His doctor had told him he was likely just suffering from physical exhaustion and stress from school, prescribing him vitamins and bed rest. But the treatment did not help. The numbness in Felix's hands had now spread all the way up his forearms, and he was constantly dizzy. This morning, Felix was determined to get out of bed and take a shower. But as he stood up, his legs completely buckled beneath him. He grabbed the bedroom door frame to keep from falling. He tried to take a step, but it was like his brain could not send signals to his legs. He collapsed to the floor and had to painfully crawl back to his bed. Terrified, he called his mother and begged her to drive him to the nearest hospital. That afternoon, Felix was admitted to the emergency room, where a team of neurologists began running tests. They tested him for genetic disorders, brain injuries, and drug use, but everything came back clean. The lead neurologist noted that the swelling in Felix's brain and spinal cord was severe, which explained his loss of motor control and intense nausea. She suspected a rare autoimmune reaction where his own body was attacking his nervous system. Over the next 6 days, Felix's condition rapidly degenerated. His face became swollen, his eyes glazed over, and he could barely speak. When the neurologist visited him, she asked how he was feeling. Felix struggled to focus his eyes, looked at her, and croaked out the words, "metal mouth," followed by "taste water." The neurologist realized he was complaining of an intense metallic taste in his mouth and wanted water. But when she gave him a cup, his throat muscles were so weak that he could not swallow, and the water just spilled down his chin. Recognizing that Felix was dying and her treatments were doing nothing, the neurologist had him transferred to a specialized university hospital. But the specialists there were just as baffled. Felix was now experiencing complete kidney and liver failure. By September of 2016, Felix had slipped into a deep coma, keeping him alive only through life support. One dedicated specialist refused to give up. He began combing through thousands of rare medical research papers, looking for any case that matched Felix's bizarre progression of symptoms. Finally, he found a paper describing a case with the exact same symptoms: stomach cramps, numbness, loss of coordination, brain swelling, a metallic taste, and organ failure. The diagnosis was incredibly rare: acute, severe mercury poisoning. The doctor ran a blood test on Felix, and it came back positive for highly elevated levels of mercury. The doctor was horrified. This was not a natural illness. Someone had intentionally poisoned Felix. The doctor immediately contacted the police. Investigators searched Felix's apartment, his car, and his university, testing everything for traces of mercury, but they found nothing. They interviewed his family and friends, but no one had a motive to hurt him. Because there were no other victims, the investigation eventually stalled, and Felix remained in a vegetative state for the next 2 years. Then, in May of 2018, things took a dark turn at the factory where Felix had worked. For years, employees at the company had complained of frequent minor illnesses like headaches and stomach pain, which they assumed was just a bug going around. But now, Otto, the older man who had complained of a headache to Felix, had suffered complete kidney failure and was on dialysis 3 times a week. Another young worker named Elias began experiencing crippling, severe stomach cramps just like Felix had on a warm afternoon. Elias sat down in the break room to eat his lunch. He unwrapped his sandwich, which he had left in the communal fridge earlier that morning, but as he was about to take a bite, he noticed a strange, fine gray powder sprinkled on top of the ham. Elias thought it looked like dust or mold, so he threw the sandwich away. But the next day, he found the same gray powder on his fresh sandwich. Suspecting someone was tampering with his food, Elias took the sandwich to the factory manager, who immediately called the police. Forensic analysts tested the gray powder on Elias's sandwich and discovered it was a highly toxic compound of lead. The police quickly obtained a warrant to search the home of Klaus, the quiet, bizarre co-worker who had been sitting at the table with Felix and Otto on the day Felix got sick. When detectives searched Klaus's basement, they were shocked. It was set up like a professional chemical laboratory, filled with hundreds of jars containing deadly poisons. Klaus had been buying toxic chemicals like mercury, lead, and cadmium online. For years, he had been sneaking into the break room and sprinkling these deadly poisons onto his co-workers' lunches simply because he wanted to watch them suffer and die. Klaus was arrested and charged with multiple counts of attempted murder. Throughout his trial, Klaus refused to offer any motive for his horrific crimes. In March of 2019, he was sentenced to life in prison. Tragically, 10 months after Klaus was sentenced, Felix, who had been in a vegetative state for 3 years, passed away from his injuries. Otto and Elias survived, but they will suffer from the agonizing, permanent effects of heavy metal poisoning for the rest of their lives. For our 5th story, we are going to San Diego, California, on the chilly winter evening of December 29, 1986. A California Highway Patrol officer named Craig Pyre was driving his marked police cruiser down Interstate 15. Sitting in the back seat of his cruiser was an NBC News reporter, and in the front passenger seat was a cameraman. The news crew was filming a special segment for the evening news about highway safety, and Officer Pyre had volunteered to be the face of the campaign. As Pyre drove down the highway, he pointed out a sign for Mercy Road and turned to the camera, stating that this was the exact spot where a tragedy had occurred just 36 hours earlier. On the morning of December 28th, a 20-year-old college student named Kara Knott had been found strangled to death in a dark, isolated creek bed right near the Mercy Road exit. Kara had been driving home to her parents' house after visiting her boyfriend, but she never made it. Her white Volkswagen was found parked in a dark cul-de-sac near the exit, and her body was discovered nearby. Because the killer was still at large, the police and the news station wanted to educate drivers, especially young women, on how to stay safe if their car broke down on the dark highway. Officer Pyre looked directly into the camera and gave a series of safety tips. He warned that stopping on the highway was incredibly hazardous because drivers often felt the urge to get out of their cars. He explained that if you are a female, getting out of your car in the dark puts you at extreme risk of being robbed, assaulted, or even killed. He strongly advised that drivers should stay locked inside their vehicles and never, under any circumstances, get into a car with a stranger. As they were filming, Pyre spotted a car pulled over on the shoulder of the highway with its hazard lights flashing. He told the camera crew that this was the perfect opportunity to demonstrate a real-life safety intervention. Pyre pulled his cruiser behind the stalled car, activated his emergency lights, and walked up to the vehicle. Inside was a young man who had run out of gas. He had walked to a gas station, returned with a gas can, but his car still would not start. On camera, Officer Pyre gave the young man a stern lecture, asking him if he realized how incredibly dangerous it was to walk alone along the highway at night. Payer then called a tow truck for the motorist, and the news crew wrapped up their filming. Later that evening, Officer Payer's segment aired on the local news. The segment was highly polished, showcasing Payer as a dedicated, caring officer working hard to keep the community safe. For most viewers, it was just a routine public safety video. But for a group of young women watching the broadcast in San Diego, the video was absolute horror. Within minutes of the broadcast ending, the San Diego Police Department was flooded with phone calls from terrified women. All of them had the exact same shocking story. They told detectives that the handsome, safety-conscious officer on TV, Craig Payer, was a predator. These women explained that over the past several months, they had been pulled over by Officer Payer while driving alone on Interstate 15 at night. In each case, Payer would target young, attractive women, turn on his emergency lights, and order them to pull off the highway at the dark, isolated Mercy Road exit. Once they were in the dark cul-de-sac, Payer would force the women out of their cars, keep them detained for hours, and ask them highly inappropriate personal questions. He would only let them go after making them promise not to tell anyone. When detectives watched the news footage again, they noticed a critical detail. In the close-up shots of Officer Payer talking about safety, there was a fresh, deep scratch running across his face and eyebrow. Detectives immediately launched an investigation into their fellow officer. They searched Payer's patrol car and found fibers that matched the clothing Kara Kanat had been wearing on the night she was murdered. They also found scratches on Payer's hands, consistent with a struggle. The pieces of the puzzle quickly fell into place. On the night of December 27th, Kara Knott was driving home when Officer Payer targeted her. He activated his police lights and ordered her to pull off at the Mercy Road exit, leading her down into the dark, isolated cul-de-sac. But unlike the other women Payer had targeted, Kara realized something was wrong. When Payer tried to assault her, Kara fought back fiercely, scratching his face and fighting for her life. Enraged and fearing that his career would be ruined if she reported him, Payer used a rope to strangle Kara to death and then threw her body over the edge of the bridge into the creek bed below. Craig Payer was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. His trial shocked the nation, exposing how a trusted officer of the law had used his badge to prey on vulnerable women. In 1988, Payer was found guilty of Kara's murder and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. He has been denied parole multiple times, and his actions remain one of the most chilling cases of police betrayal in American history. Our sixth story takes us to the skies over Antarctica on the afternoon of November 28, 1979. An Air New Zealand DC-10, operating as Flight TE-901, was cruising gracefully through the sky. This was a highly unique, incredibly popular sightseeing flight that took off from Auckland, New Zealand, flew over the icy landscapes of Antarctica, and returned the same day. There were 237 passengers on board, all of them incredibly wealthy tourists who had paid a fortune to see the frozen continent from above. Standing at the front of the passenger cabin was a 52-year-old experienced tour guide and explorer named Peter Mulgrew. Peter had traveled to Antarctica many times and was highly knowledgeable about the geography and history of the icy continent. He held a microphone pointing out various landmarks to the excited passengers. Because this was a leisure sightseeing flight, the atmosphere on board was like a massive party. Passengers were laughing, drinking champagne, and walking freely around the cabin, pressing their cameras against the windows to take stunning photographs of the glaciers below. After a few hours, Peter grabbed the microphone and announced to the cabin that they were about to approach one of the most spectacular sights of the entire trip. He told the passengers to look out the left side of the aircraft to see the beautiful, rugged coastline of Antarctica. A few minutes later, he instructed everyone to move to the right side of the plane, announcing that they were now flying past Mount Erebus, a massive active volcano that rose over 12,000 feet into the sky. The passengers crowded along the right windows, gasping at the sheer beauty of the massive, snow-covered volcano. But just as they were snapping photos, the entire aircraft suddenly jolted violently. The engines roared to life at maximum power, and a split second later, the plane slammed directly into the side of the volcano. The crash was instantaneous and catastrophic. One of the passengers on the right side of the plane had clicked their camera shutter at the exact microsecond of the impact, capturing a final, terrifying image. The photo showed the peaceful cabin window, but with thick black streaks of oil and soot instantly splattering across the glass as the plane disintegrated against the rock and ice. All 237 passengers and 15 crew members were killed instantly. The investigation into the crash of Flight TE-901 revealed a series of tragic, systemic failures. The pilots had been given incorrect flight coordinates by the airline's navigation team before departure. They believed they were flying safely down a wide, flat valley, when in reality, their direct path led them straight toward the massive volcano. Because of a unique polar weather phenomenon known as a sector whiteout, the light reflecting off the snow on the volcano matched the clouds perfectly, making the massive mountain completely invisible to the pilots until it was too late. The disaster remains the worst aviation accident in New Zealand's history, and it permanently ended the era of commercial Antarctic sightseeing flights. For our final story, we are going back to the summer of 1945 to a beautiful mountain town in New Mexico called Ruidoso. On the morning of July 16th, a 13-year-old girl named Barbara Kent was fast asleep inside a rustic wooden cabin. Barbara was attending a highly prestigious summer dance camp, and she was staying in the cabin along with 9 other teenage girls. At exactly 5:30 a.m., a massive, deafening booming sound ripped through the quiet valley. The shockwave was so incredibly powerful that it literally shook the cabin, throwing Barbara and several of her cabin mates completely out of their beds and onto the wooden floor. The girls sat on the floor, crying and screaming, completely terrified. A moment later, their dance instructor burst into the cabin, looking deeply concerned. She told the girls that she believed one of the camp's water heaters or gas furnaces had suffered a massive explosion, and that there might be a fire spreading through the property. She ordered the girls to put on their robes, run outside, and stand safely by the edge of the river while she searched the camp for the source of the blast. Barbara and the other 9 girls ran out into the chilly morning air and stood by the rushing water, shivering with fear. But as they waited, Barbara felt a cold, soft sensation on her nose. She looked up and was shocked to see tiny white flakes gently falling from the sky. It was snowing. The other girls looked up in wonder, laughing and catching the flakes in their hands. It was the middle of July in New Mexico, where temperatures regularly reached over 90 degrees, yet a thick blanket of white snow was falling all around them. A few minutes later, the dance instructor returned and told the girls that she had searched the entire property and found no signs of fire or damage. Everything seemed completely safe. Relieved, the girls asked if they could change into their swimsuits and go swimming in the river while the snow fell. The instructor, charmed by the beautiful, bizarre weather, agreed. The girls ran inside, changed, and spent the next several hours splashing in the water, scooping up the white snow from the riverbanks and rubbing it onto their faces and arms. It was a magical morning, and the instructor even took a picture of Barbara smiling in the river as the snow fell around her. After a few hours, the snow stopped, the flakes dissolved in the water, and the girls went back to their normal camp activities. When the summer ended, Barbara and her friends returned to their homes, never receiving an explanation for the July snow. But 17 years later, when Barbara was 30 years old, she began to receive devastating news. One by one, every single one of the other 9 girls who had attended the dance camp with her died. Each of them had been diagnosed with incredibly rare, highly aggressive forms of cancer that claimed their lives in their 20s and early 30s. Barbara was the only survivor. She could not understand why her friends had all died of the same horrible disease. She did not get her answer until decades later, in 2006, when the United States government finally released classified documents about the events of July 16, 1945. It turned out that the massive explosion that had knocked the girls out of their beds was not a heater. It was the detonation of the world's first atomic bomb. The government had conducted the secret Trinity test of the Manhattan Project in the desert, just 40 miles away from the dance camp. Without warning any of the local residents, the beautiful white snow that the girls had played in rubbed on their faces, and swam in was not snow at all. It was highly radioactive nuclear fallout consisting of ash, plutonium, and debris that had been blown high into the atmosphere and carried by the wind. The 9 young girls had been coated in deadly radiation, which slowly destroyed their bodies over the next 2 decades. Barbara survived, but she spent the rest of her life battling multiple severe cancers, carrying the permanent physical scars of a secret that destroyed the lives of her childhood friends. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya.